on at the site and in the vicinity of the site. They're looking at air, they're looking at soil, they're looking at water. They continue to say nothing rises to the level of a public health risk. Now, the EPA, when they were back in 2008 talking about a proposed cap for Westlake landfill, they also looked at things like long-term exposure. That's kind of how they evaluate what the real risk is. And part of their calculus concluded that you are 30 times greater risk of radiation exposure living in Denver today than you are if your job is to go out there to Westlake landfill and say trim the trees or mow some of the vegetation down there 8 hours a day over the course of 40 years. So no, when you're talking about long-term exposure, that's not and risk, that's not really what's happening at Westlake.
I want to read from you from this EPA report. It says, and this is their scientists, the EPA, we do not support the conclusion that no additional long-term risks will be created in the event. There are at least two risk pathways that could exist. The first, through increased air exposures to contaminants such as radon. Mm-hmm. The second pathway is increased leachate production that could move contaminants and dissolve radon gas into the groundwater. So the EPA says there are two, airborne and groundwater.
Yeah, they're saying there could be two things. When they're talking about radon, what they're talking about is if those radionuclide isotopes were somehow to be released, it would manifest in the form of a radon molecule. And that radon molecule has a shelf life of 3 days. Generally we're talking about rim that's well below surface. So that radon molecule would, kind of migrate up to surface level. It would begin the decay process as it's migrating up to ground surface level. Without a cap, yeah, the EPA has said, and this is one reason why we think there needs to be a cap, that there is the risk for some radon release. Now, in Missouri, people are familiar with radon. You got to do radon checks in your mm-hmm. basements. It's just part of living here. In terms of long-term health and safety risks, again, the CDC continues to believe that the site is safe, but it's when you're talking about radon, that's one more reason why you need that cap.
All right, I want to go back to the cap again, because the EPA said in 2008 when they first looked at this that a cap would work. They're looking at it again. Their mm-hmm. results are going to come back the end of 2017, I guess. Their final...
Into 2016.
Into 2016, okay. If the EPA comes back and says, we don't need a cap, we need encapsulation. Mm-hmm. Is Republic Services ready and willing and able to accept those findings?
So the EPA is going to make a decision about what the remedy should be at Westlake landfill. That's their call. That's not our call. Keep in mind, we're one of three potentially responsible parties. So PRPs, potentially responsible parties, are part of the EPA Superfund process. And essentially, those are the entities that are going to pay for whatever remedy the EPA chooses. We're one. There's a company called Exelon through a subsidiary that it has, and then the U.S. Department of Energy is the third because of the Atomic Energy Agency's legacy with the Manhattan Project. So we're only talking about a third of whatever that expense would be for a remedy, but it's going to be the EPA's decision. We're as anxious as anybody to see, that decision. The community has waited. I think one thing we can all agree on is that the community's had to wait a long time for a remedy at Westlake landfill.
Right. So if the EPA comes back and says we need to encapsulate it, then ball game's over. You guys are going to go about working with the two other entities to get it encapsulated?
I guess my question would be, what does encapsulation mean? And so it's hard to get into semantics and nuances and have a meaningful conversation. We'll have to see what the EPA comes up with.
Right.
But at the end, it's their call. They make the decision about what happens there.
It's been explained to me that a cap and encapsulation are two completely different things. You agree with that?
Generally speaking, yeah, I would say that's probably true. But, when you're talking about encapsulating at a site where, I've got a lot of knowledge, I've spent a ton of time there, I'd have to say, what does that mean? It's not for me to say, oh, yeah, okay, thumbs up here as we speak in November of 2015. You will just have to see what the EPA comes back with. And it's going to be based on, as part of that remedy for what happens at Westlake, it's going to be based on a ton of science.
Russ Naki, our guest, Vice President of Communications for Republic Services. Two more questions for you, and then
Sure.
I'll let you go. The larger question is that there's a landfill that's smoldering, that smells, intertwined with a nuclear waste dump. It sounds really scary.
Well,
and for people who are living over there, even if it's safe, even if there's no long-term effects, even if there's no short-term effects, I'm not sure too many people would want to buy a house next to a burning landfill interspersed with a nuclear waste dump.
Well, I'm really glad that you bring that up. So Bridgeton Landfill is where the subsurface, the exothermic chemical reaction is occurring. And Westlake, again, to be clear, is where the radiologically impacted material is, and they're next to one another. There are a number of industrial sites in the vicinity of the landfills. There are also some neighborhoods like Spanish Village, which is a charming neighborhood. I think that this hysteria, this fear, maybe down the road one day it could begin to, when people are putting signs in their front yards, with nuclear symbols and talking about deaths and, just kind of scary stuff. Down the road in time, maybe that could begin to affect property values. My understanding from the St. Louis County assessor is that property values have not been affected as of yet, as we speak today. But, if this fear, this misinformation, this hysteria perpetuates, then perhaps down the road, what that leads to, though, is what does that mean for Bridgeton? We base our entire St. Louis operations. We serve about half of metropolitan St. Louis. We base those operations in Bridgeton. We employ, close to 500 people in Bridgeton. We're a big part of the tax base there. The more that people keep talking about, the fear, the misinformation, and the disinformation, you do have to ask yourself, what does that mean for the future of Bridgeton? Because some of that, in some people's minds is going to stick, and it's going to form a negative perception about a city we're proud to be based in.
Russ Naki, Vice President of Communications for Republic Services. A lot of people are getting phone calls from a group called the Coalition to Keep Us Safe, which is out there promoting an idea that the nuclear waste should be left there and not transported somewhere else. Is Republic Services funding the Coalition to Keep Us Safe?
We help the Coalition to Keep Us Safe. It's an independent group of people that form together. We help to get off the ground. And as I've said for well over a year now, on occasion we'll continue to help them if they need, financial support to host a meeting, or maybe it's travel to move somewhere, to go somewhere to host something. We've helped reimburse their chief spokesperson, who is on the western part of the state, with some of her, expenses as she's gone about doing what she chooses to do on a volunteer basis. She's got a full-time job. She's a mom just like any other mom, but she's got a completely different perspective about what ultimately should happen at Westlake Landfill. And that perspective is that a cap needs to be placed on it, because the alternative narrative is, as I said before, the notion of full excavation of the site. Then you get into looking at what the EPA said that would involve. And you're talking about 30 some odd years, for a project of that nature at the base of Lambert Airport. The airport, the FAA, they've got very strong feelings about the notion of anything digging into waste. So it gets really complex. And so folks in central Missouri, western part of the state, they really dislike the idea that things are going to be shipped, whether it's highway or rail or however, through their communities for as much as 3 decades.
Isn't there nuclear waste being shipped now through Missouri on rail?
I couldn't say. I've heard people make that claim. I don't know, but again, if you want to have some of the coalition members, and there are some that are based here in St. Louis, if you want to have them come in, I'm sure they'd love to talk to you. But they've got their own views. We help them when they ask for some help.
So it's an independent group, but you help them financially from time to time.
From time to time, yeah.
And you help them get off the ground.
We did.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is Russ Naki, Vice President Communications with Republic Services. Anything else you want to mention that I didn't ask?
Yeah, I just want to leave your audience with this point. Bridgeton Landfill is safe. It is in a managed state. The entire site is safe and intensely monitored. I'd argue it's probably the most intensely monitored landfill in the country, if not certainly very close. You've got 24/7 monitoring of what's going on at the site, to include air, to include water. We are optimistic that in 2016 we'll begin as a community to get to a place where there's resolution in the form of, we'll know whether there's going to be an isolation barrier and what that might look like. Resolution in the form of having a decision about a remedy for Westlake Landfill and what that looks like. Meanwhile, for our part, the Bridgeton piece, the piece that we actually control, we're going to continue to manage that reaction, and eventually it will self-extinguish.
So the fire will just burn out naturally?
Eventually, we believe it'll self-extinguish.
Before it gets to the nuclear waste?
Absolutely.
Russ Naki, Vice President of Communications. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
946, Big 550, KTRS.
This is McGraw Live on KPLR.